Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 249, Dangerous Religious Ideas. Before we start today's show, we just want to remind you that we are in the middle of our Hanukkah Geldraiser. That's what we're calling this year's fundraiser, where we're trying to support our work here on Judaism Unbound as well as Jewish Live. And we are asking our listeners, our viewers, if they might be willing to contribute just $36. If you're able to contribute more, that's wonderful. Or $3 a month. There's an opportunity to give a monthly amount. If you go to www.geldraiser.com, that's G-E-L-T, Razor.com. And if you can't remember that, you can just go to the Jewish Live or Judaism Unbound homepage and click through to the Geldraiser. And if you do give $36 or more, or $3 a month or more, you will be invited to an 8-day Hanukkah celebration extravaganza where we're going to be having some of our favorite guests from Judaism Unbound there each night, as well as doing all kinds of new reimagined rituals and just schmoozing with the community of Judaism Unbound and Jewish Live people. So if you're one of those people and you might consider that this is a good time of year to support our work, please consider giving $36 to our Geldraiser. And again, that's www.geldraiser.com. Now let's jump into this week's episode. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And our guest today, Rachel Mikva, is the author of a new book that was just published called Dangerous Religious Ideas: The Deep Roots of Self-Critical Faith in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And we thought it would be a really interesting follow-up conversation to our discussion last week about the election and how Jewish ideas or religious ideas in general might or might not have a place in considering what we're going to do as a country and what we might want to support in terms of our politics. In the description of the book, Dangerous Religious Ideas reveals how faith traditions have always passed down tools for self-examination and debate, because all religious ideas, not just extremist ones, can cause harm, even as they also embody important moral teachings. Our guest today, Rachel Mikva, is the Rabbi Herman E. Shulman Chair and Professor of Jewish Studies and Senior Faculty Fellow of the Interreligious Institute at the Chicago Theological Seminary. Before becoming a professor, she was a congregational rabbi for 13 years. Her research and teaching focus on interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, exploring how the ideas both shape and reflect the societies in which they unfold. Rachel Mikva has rabbinic ordination from the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, that's the flagship institution of the Reform movement, and a PhD from the Jewish Theological Seminary, that's the flagship institution of the conservative movement. And she now teaches at a school that at least has its roots as a Christian theological seminary. Now it's a lot more ecumenical. So she certainly has the biography to be able to explore the wide range of religious ideas, and we're excited to talk about the dangerous ones. So Rachel Mikva, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here with you and Lex.
We were really excited to get your book, especially since just last week was the election, and we've been talking about various religious ideas that have animated aspects of the election. So I think this is going to be a really great continuation to that conversation. When I opened the book, actually, I listened to the audiobook, but when I started listening to it, I was getting ready to get a long list of dangerous religious ideas. I was really excited to find out what all of them were. And one of the very first things that the book says is all religious ideas are dangerous.
That's right.
So I wanted to start by diving into that to understand a little bit about why you see all religious ideas as dangerous and how are they dangerous?
When I talk about danger, I mean various things, right? Sometimes danger manifests as violence, but it can also be social harm, psychological harm. And if you think about something as simple as God as a dangerous religious idea, I'm not talking about, or at least not talking only about, people who kill each other because they think you have the wrong God, but the fact that over 40% of Americans think that you have to believe in God in order to be an ethical person. that's dangerous. That's dangerous to our social fabric. And so what I talk about in the book is the first time I taught this course, I asked the students what they would put on the board. And of course, they started with somebody else's religious ideas first. But within 30 seconds, and this is a classroom filled with, at the time, they were almost all Christian, Protestant folks studying for mostly a Master of Divinity degree. So committed Christians, they quickly realized that pretty much anything could make the list because at some point in time, they'd manifested harm to various people. Ideas that have power, as religious ideas do, have the potential for danger. Now, I talk a lot in the book, of course, about the great benefit of religion too. The book starts with a quote by Swami Vivekananda that talks about religion sort of being the foundation for some of the greatest good and the greatest harm that he could think of. But I feel particularly responsible for shepherding the power of religious ideas as a rabbi and a scholar of religion, because all kinds of ideas can fall into that tension of danger and possibility. But there are particularities around religious ideas that I think we need to grapple with. One is ultimacy, right? The capacity for religious ideas to override other criteria we may have for what we think of as just or good, or even to deny evidence of countervailing ideas. That's been a tension around religious ideas ever since religion resisted the idea that the earth rotates around the sun. It's also, religion is woven through every aspect of our psyche and society, and that magnifies the power and presence of religious ideas. So they're embedded in so many things that aren't religious per se, but religious ideas get into it and have power within it. And politics is a really good example of that. And then the third thing, since I just mentioned politics, that I think we need to grapple with is that in the public square in America today, religious ideas generally get a pass. And I think that that's a particular problem, and that we need to think about the protection of religious ideas differently, and that religious ideas also need to be critically examined in the public square. Bringing a religious reason for one's political position shouldn't be allowed to end debate.
Okay, so religious ideas are dangerous, all of them. This is a good start. Very fun and provocative way to open the podcast. This is going to be fun. I really appreciate the way in which you name that and frame it. And just for those who haven't read your book, like, you're not coming at this as like, rah, rah, guns blazing, religion is terrible. Like, that's actually not the angle you're coming from. You're not coming from the opposite angle that religion is like inherently amazing. But I just want to make that clear, since the title, like, somebody could think it's just, like a new atheist book or something, that it gives you all the lists of how religion is uniquely the worst thing on the planet. But all that said, what I love is that you take, I don't know if it's a tack or like, you go in a direction that is different from how I hear a lot of my friends and loved ones talk about religion, which is, you do not say religion is good, and then when it's used for bad, it's sort of a warping or a perversion. Like, people are taking something that's inherently just and righteous, and because they're using it for whatever evil purpose they have, they're sort of changing what religion is to fit their bad goals. I hear that a lot from well-meaning, wonderful people. You say something different, which is, there actually is a danger inherent to both, if I'm reading you correctly, both to the religious ideas that you list and include, and to the very fact of layering any idea with sacred ultimacy in the way you just talked about. That in and of itself, almost without respect to the content of the idea, means that it's going to be used really passionately, really intensely. And so I'd love to hear more from you about that. Like, how should we be thinking about sort of what religious or religion is, and how shouldn't we? How should we be talking about the ways people use and don't use religion?
Let me start with the subtitle of the book. The subtitle of the book is The Deep Roots of Self-Critical Faith in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So to your first point, right, it is not an attack on religion. It's trying to not only grapple with the positive and negative power of religious ideas, but also to recognize that we've been doing this work as part of our tradition, right? It's part of the spiritual inheritance of our traditions to be self-critical in our faith in order to improve the religious project. The seeds for this work are planted deep inside the traditions and transmitted along with the sacred stories and teaching. When I would speak in progressive communities, there was frequently an assumption that, well, we've already reformed our ideas, so nothing in our religion is actually dangerous. It's always somebody else's religion. And in more traditional spaces, there was this concern that if you ask critical questions, that will necessarily weaken faith. And I wanted to problematize both those assumptions, because the traditions I know anything about, which are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have recognized that self-critical faith will deepen faith, make it stronger, and help shape it more as a force of blessing in the world. It's not that, that it was ever done perfectly or that we can do it perfectly, but it is a tool in the toolbox of faith. So when you're thinking about your friends who recognize that there's bad stuff being done in the name of religion, but think, well, that's a distortion, that's a warping of religion, I feel a little differently. I think that we have to accept as religious anything that anybody does in the name of religion. We may think that it distorts what we feel religion should do, but we can't say it's not religious. If you look at the history of the power and impact of religion over time, you'll find that it encompasses the spectrum of human possibility, from our most virtuous to our most deadly and destructive. And I don't think we can name those as not religious. If we say, well, that bad stuff isn't religious, we are somehow replicating the judgment that sometimes comes from more conservative religious voices who would say, well, my way is the only true way. So I want to avoid that judgment about each other's faith, that somehow these aren't religious, and instead grapple with the impact together that our diversities have on each other. I also think that the idealized form of religion, right, people who say, but religion is just peace and love and justice, right, those can also be dangerous. If you look at the history of Judaism, Christian love has been pretty deadly in many places and times. The desire to save the Jewish soul has resulted in tortures and forced conversions and mass murders and all kinds of things. So the manifestations of love we know, even on a much smaller scale, and if you take religion out of it, sometimes the way we express our love in intimate family is hurtful. And so too with the nature of love cast in religious ideas. Peace can be and has been the maintaining of the status quo that perpetuates injustice. There is no way to strip away all the dark stuff as if it were a skin and peel it off and then have left this pure religious, all good center. That's not really the way religion works.
So I wanted to hone in on a very specific part of your book, like an exercise that you described that I think where there was a group of people, some Muslims, some Christians, some Jews, and they did an exercise with each other where the point was to find your own religious tradition's worst text. What they had to do, which I think is such a great exercise, is they had to look into their own tradition and specifically find the one that is most problematic. And then together, and this is a scary kind of exercise, I think. Together, they had to look at these with people from other traditions and talk about the problematics of them. And that was so refreshing to me. That's the kind of, that's the kind of discussion I'd really want to be a part of, because, and it's not just that it's like new and invigorating or different. It's that I think that a different kind of posture emerges from that, a different kind of orientation to the world emerges from that, where we don't think our role when we're talking with people that are like outsiders. We're like, I think this comes up for Jews, like we're a minority. And when we're talking to people who aren't Jews, we think that what we need to do is like emphasize the ways that Judaism is good, because there's been lots of oppression in history. It's not invalid to feel that way. But I actually think that sharing our own insecurities about our traditions, our own worries, our own real anxieties and problems with what our texts say has the potential to build bridges and connections in a way that just sharing, oh, here's my text's version of love your neighbor as yourself, and here's your text version of love your neighbor as yourself. Like great, but that felt powerful. And just to bring up a contemporary example, I'm sorry I'm ranting, but this is very exciting to me.
Go for it.
I was, following much pre-election, back when we were in the primary stage, a really interesting development occurred where Pete Buttigieg, a liberal person, not a conservative, was using as one of his core talking points the idea that Republicans, and in particular certain Republicans that he would name by name, were hypocrites and Pharisees. He used the language of Pharisees from the New Testament. And he's a part of, progressive Christianity. He's not coming from like a right-wing evangelical theology. But him mobilizing that, in my view, was really problematic. It was problematic to enough people that it was communicated to him and he stopped using that talking point. But what I think it illustrated is that when you don't do that work of thinking about some of your own tradition's problem texts, then bad stuff arises, even from a place of good intentions. You talk about a group of people, the Pharisees, that actually are sort of in certain senses, not all senses, originators of Judaisms that would follow. Like you talk about them as if they're terrible. And there's people on the planet that are heirs of that tradition that could be rightly feeling insulted. So I wanted to bring that up. Like, what are some of the reasons why it's not just sort of trivial? Like, what happens? What changes about a person or a group when they take on this effort of doing the self-critical faith, of looking for those problematic spots?
It's a great set of questions. So yes, I talk about an interreligious project around just peace. So just peace is a set of practices that emerged out of the Christian community, out of the Protestant community. And then Susan Thistlethwaite, my colleague at Chicago Theological Seminary at the time, developed an interreligious version of that project where she got Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars together to try to develop what would interreligious or interfaith just peace practices look like, and how would we talk about those. And they kept bumping into a wall. They just couldn't get into the work because it was sort of like they were saying, but our traditions are our traditions of peace. Why, what do we need to work on this stuff for? And then they finally hit on this idea that they would bring each other their worst text, the one that revealed violence embedded in their scriptural tradition. And suddenly a path opened before them, because this really is liberative for interreligious work. It made them less defensive and more open. They didn't have to say, you Christians, you've used the New Testament to justify killing us, because the Christians had already said it. At the same time, we have to recognize that those with social power have an easier time admitting the ugly stuff than those who are already under siege. So I think, for instance, in the context of anti-Muslim bias that so pervades America today, in interreligious work, it's a little harder for Muslims to acknowledge the more difficult and challenging texts and teachings and parts of Islamic history. But I do feel like that shared struggle of self-critical faith is the essential glue of a diverse society. We can't pretend that it's always pretty and just focus on those things we have in common. We need to excavate the differences, and we even need to excavate the difficulties. And when you talk about Pete Buttigieg and this problematic speech and the outcry that resulted from it, it made me reflect on similar experiences I have with my students. So my Christian students have absorbed, accidentally and often without realizing it, substantial parts of anti-Judaism that is embedded in the New Testament polemic against the Pharisees. They carry residue of judgments around spirit and the law, or the idea that somehow Judaism in antiquity was parochial, so Paul invents universalism, the way Al Gore invented the internet. And when you help them understand the way you experience those ideas, then they can see their tradition in a new way. So I think we need each other to do the self-critical work, and we need to be willing to say to each other, let me share with you how I hear what you're saying.
One thing I wanted to ask you about was the extent to which at least some of the danger of religious ideas comes from their origin in a time when the religious group was weaker and then become dysfunctional when they become stronger. And I'm thinking in particular about one of the main ideas that you cover in the book, which is this idea of chosenness or election, where it feels to me like when you're an oppressed community and you want to feel like, oh, actually, it seems like God hates us, but actually we're chosen. Actually we're getting ready for something really important, or we're really beloved, and this is part of the ordeal that we have to go through. All of those things seem very functional. The problem is that years later, when you might find yourself in a position of power and you're the chosen one with power, that's a very dangerous thing. So I'm wondering to what extent you see that as a common theme throughout ideas that become dangerous, or actually not so much that any idea becomes dangerous, that just happens to be one of them. And I'm wondering whether there are good examples of religious traditions really waking up to the need to go through this kind of interpretive modification of those dangerous ideas, in particular when they're confronted with power. Actually, as I'm saying that, I think a little bit about the way that Germany reacted after the Holocaust. This idea that they kind of realized what horrible things had flowed from their power and actually took it seriously and made some real changes in their society. I guess I'm wondering whether we see that in the history of religion as well.
I do agree with you. And I think you've named something very important, which is that other kinds of power, right? Political power, military power, when coupled with religious ideas, will magnify its potential both for good and for destruction, which is the part that you were emphasizing. And so the ways in which chosenness is problematized from the beginning, right? It's seen self-critically, both for what it can do that is good and what it can do that is problematic. The prophets problematize it. I argue that it's actually problematized already in Genesis, that we have to grapple with what it means to think about God choosing. So I do treat in the book, later on, I look at what happens when Israel gains state power and some small segment of the population links that power to chosenness, right? How do they then want to wield that power? And it's profoundly problematic. So power will other kinds of power will magnify the power of religious ideas for good and for ill. One of the interesting examples to watch in terms of self-critical capacities to see the dangers and dismantle them to the extent that we can is watching the ongoing disestablishment of Protestantism, right? And the fierce blowback right now from certain segments of the Protestant community and even more broadly the Christian community of the disestablishment of Christianity in the United States, right? It's been a global project of disestablishmentism, and no version of it is good, right? Is it good that France forbids people in their embrace of secularity, forbids Muslim women from wearing niqab and hijab? No, I don't think so, right? So secularism has some of the same dangers. But at the same time, I'm grateful as a religious minority that Protestantism has been through a process of disestablishmentism in this country. It doesn't make everybody happy, but it's an important process because we cannot have it coupled with state power.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the digital revolution, and ultimately I'm trying to make a connection between that and the invention of the the printing press and therefore the Protestant Reformation and also the Reform movement within Judaism. Because it feels to me like there's a danger and an opportunity in regular people being able to have more access to scripture and to other texts, because it feels like one of the things that happened in the Reformation and that has happened in Judaism is that a lot of people read the Bible and they find all kinds of things in the Bible, some of which are good and some of which are scary and dangerous. And they have no idea that these things that are in the Bible have actually gone through a millennia or two of change within those religious traditions, both Judaism and Christianity. And I assume the same is true in Islam. On the one hand, it feels like there's an opportunity there to get a second bite at the apple, so to speak, and get away from some of the bad and dangerous manipulations that some of those ideas have had when there have only been very small elites that were able to read and really know about those concepts and that often misuse them, or, I would say misuse them or use them as a cudgel. And so we can say, well, actually, that doesn't mean what you think it's meant because of all these wars that were fought over it, and we can engage in another reinterpretation. But the other obviously the flip side of that is that there are things like, and you write about an eye for an eye, lex talionis, things like that, you could read the Bible and say, oh, well, you should take out somebody's eye if they take out your eye, and it turns out that every religious tradition, or I think, certainly Judaism and Christianity interpreted that over time to not actually mean that you're supposed to take out somebody's eye if they injure your eye. But somebody who all of a sudden just has access to the Bible through the internet doesn't know any of that. Now that we're on the cusp of technologies that make the Bible and all kinds of other religious ideas just ubiquitously available to people who don't have the benefit of those traditions through which to read them, are there any best practices that we can learn from previous attempts?
Well, I will point out that there are a lot of people, not very many Jews, but there are a lot of people who still think that the life for life part of lex talionis applies. It's considered brutal and inhuman to cut out somebody's hand, but somehow people still think capital punishment is a good idea. So, but going back to your broader question, the Reformation with its idea of sola scriptura really was just trying to shed, right, the magisterium's power to determine the Catholic Church's power to determine what is going to be the meaning of Scripture. But the Catholic tradition had, in fact, preserved multiple voices, right? The most popular medieval biblical text was Glossa Ordinaria, which kind of like, for Jews who know Mikra Gedolot, this rabbinic Bible that brings commentaries from all different voices and places and puts them all on the page together as if they were in conversation with one another, but demonstrating that it's always been the meaning of the Bible has always been debated. So sola scriptura was never really meant to empower otherwise religiously ignorant people to determine the meaning of Scripture for themselves. That wasn't the intent of the Protestant challenge to Catholic control over the meaning of Scripture. So I'm hesitant to reinstall a kind of elitist versus popular tension around the power to read and interpret. But I do feel like we do have to reclaim the complexities of our traditions and that they will make our faith better. And that includes popular folks who all they're really interested in doing is picking up the text and telling you what they feel about it. I think that tradition gets used in the same way as Scripture does, to persuade ourselves that God's on our side. And so I think the key is self-critical faith with whatever tools you have. I do think that access to information in the same way that the printing press changed the world, I do think the internet is giving access to a whole host of things, including the history of tradition that could be recovered. But I think what we mostly have to change are the filters that we use for the way that we look and sift through it. We've long had the capacity to pick other people's worst texts. and use that against them, and the ones that we want to prove our own perspective as being true. So I think the key is the commitment to a self-critical filter. And what's good about that is that the litmus test is not how orthodox or progressive you are. This is a part of all of our traditions. And I think that we can recover that commitment to self-critical faith across traditions and across the spectrum within traditions.
So I really appreciated that early on in your book, you mentioned directly, I mean, if anybody's wondering, like, oh, we've talked about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we haven't talked about other religions. That's not an accident. And you're very straightforward in your intro that, like, look, you are coming at this from a place where those are your three religious traditions that you're best able to look at these questions through. There's, of course, ways in which we could talk about others. So I appreciated you being direct about this. And I would love to just sort of poke at that and ask ask some big picture questions about how these questions would look similar and maybe different from other religious perspectives. And what I mean by that is I think the question of orthodoxy, of religion based on believing a set of particular faiths. I mean, we've used the word faith a lot, versus the idea of orthopraxis, where religions, structure themselves largely. I mean, it's not such an easy binary where like, one religion is fully orthodoxy and one is orthopraxis. But like, there are many religious traditions where the idea that you start from scripture and draw beliefs and then that flows into right actions is not always like the process, but sometimes it's that the practices are actually foremost and the beliefs. I mean, I often think that this is how Judaism works, although you could debate this. Like the practices come and then we like peg a belief on top afterwards. Like we like a ritual, we like a something in the Torah, we like a holiday, and then we figure out afterwards, oh yeah, there's this thing about the holiday of Shavuot. By the way, that's when the 10 Commandments were given. Torah doesn't actually say that. It doesn't say what the meaning or purpose is. Like we decide afterwards that like that's when the thing happened or that's the purpose underneath the practice. And so the reason I asked that is because we have centered the framework of ideas. Here we are, dangerous religious ideas. We could also talk about dangerous religious practices. And I think that implicit in ideas is the concept that from ideas flow practice. And I think, ironically, that's actually kind of an Abrahamic, or at least, I mean, maybe it's Christian, maybe it's Muslim framework. And other religious traditions don't quite as thoroughly anchor themselves in that way. So basically, I'd love to ask, like, would you claim that this really is a unique danger inherent to ideas, to believing certain things? Or could it actually be that there's just danger in general to intensity of practice of religious rituals that are not just beliefs? Because once you have them, you can throw whatever existing beliefs you have on them, good or bad.
So in the book, I spend a whole chapter talking about what do I mean by dangerous? What do I mean by religious? And what do I mean by ideas? And when I get to ideas, I specifically talk about the ways these are manifest in actions, because that's where they matter, where they have impact, good and bad. And I can't talk about chicken and egg, whether we're talking about ideas that shape actions or actions that shape ideas, because I think, as you suggest, they both are real and they both are happening simultaneously and in cyclical fashion. I also think that you're right when you suggest that Christianity, in its shaping of how we think and talk about religion in the academy and in the public square, very much centers theology and the world of ideas, whereas both Judaism and Islam would give at least equal weight to praxis, right? It's about what we're doing. Mordechai Kaplan talked about, right, believing, behaving, and belonging as sort of the three doorways into what it means to identify as a Jew. And people have those in different balance. But Judaism as a whole puts a lot of weight on the ways that we behave, the practices that we do as Jews. So the reason that I focus on ideas is because this is where I can get textual evidence, right? There are records of what people actually do, and I sometimes bring those in, but the large part of literary evidence for if we're going to investigate history are the ways people are thinking. right? So that's why I'm focused and start with ideas. But practices really matter. And they certainly matter in other traditions too. So my colleague, Simratjit Singh, who's a Sikh religious leader and teacher, has a great blog on the Religion News Service called Anti-Racism as a Spiritual Practice, right? It's how do you take your tradition or the teachings of other traditions and use them to practice, to embody anti-racist work and behaviors. Clearly, traditions that don't have strong textual foundations manifest some of these same dynamics in their communal gatherings, in the ways that they do community, and in the ways that they also focus on the practices of their communities. But every community, whether it's built out of a scriptural idea of chosenness or election or not, every community creates an insider and an outsider. So you have to grapple with the power that that has, both to generate good stuff inside the community and potentially hurt people who are by design or by their own intention or not being told that they are outside the community. So I think that you've identified also a particular aspect of Jewish identity that a lot of people don't get around peoplehood, right? Our identity, we can be a secular Jew, right? And identify as a Jew, whereas a secular Christian wouldn't necessarily identify as a Christian because Christian seems to them to be an affirmation of faith. For us, it's about a corporate and communal identity of a people, a civilization. Yes, you can convert into it, you can be adopted into the family, but we're born as Jews. And I think that that shapes the way a lot of Jews think about the relationship of religion and secular space. That's different than the way some other people might.
So we are arcing towards the close. And first off, folks out there listening, get this book. You really got to read it. This, whether you want the audiobook like Dan did or the book with, pages and covers.
And the flaming red cover.
Yes, flaming red cover. So whichever version, go and read it. But I say that because in addition to folks out there just reading this and learning, I'm curious what the then what would be for folks. And I'm thinking of like two kinds of listeners, right? Because we've talked about power. One type of listener is, I think, a listener that does have a role where they have some power, where they are, whether it's a clergy member or a person that in one way or another shapes the Jewish experiences or the religious thoughts or ideas of others. What would you call on that person to do, given that they've read your book or at the very least heard your ideas on this podcast? What would you call on them to sort of change about themselves or their community or whatever? And then the other is somebody who doesn't have that power, but is just a person listening. Do they have a role here? What could they do just in their own lives? And because you've touched on this a little bit, I think it could be another good closing note. Religion exists in all sorts of settings. Some of them are, churches, synagogues, mosques, but it's also in the public square. And I know that you bring a lot to bear on that question of how religion manifests in the public square. And I think for that second group that is not powerful in like a church or synagogue or mosque context, it may be useful to think about what could they do in that setting in a public space, given that they've read your book and want to act on it.
So I do admit at the outset a sort of overly ambitious set of goals for the book. And one of them that I identify is that I'm hoping religious leaders and teachers who read it will recognize more deeply the need for self-critical faith, wield their truths a little more gently, be acutely aware of the impact of these religious ideas that they might not have thought about. For instance, your example of Pete Buttigieg not even stopping and realizing what it means to invoke the Pharisees, with a long history of Christian anti-Judaism linked to the Pharisees. That links in an interesting way to thinking about religion in the public square, both inside and outside houses of worship or religious organizations. In the book, I talk about having been raised in the tradition of John Rawls, who believed and had this very influential teaching that we should utilize public reason rather than religious beliefs in arguing a policy position. So the rules that regulate our common life should be based on arguments to which we all have equal access. It made so much sense that for much of my life, progressives seemed to cede, C-E-D-E, not S-E-E-D. They were ceding the public religious voice. It was not for lack of religious conviction, but rather for a liberal commitment to pluralism and Rawlsian public reason. And it gave the erroneous impression that political liberalism was hostile to religion, and that religious voices were being pushed out of public debate, and that religious increasingly meant conservative. As a political and a religious progressive, I don't want to relinquish the public voice of religion to people who would use it to deny individuals access to public services, or reject climate science, or legislate bias, or limit our responsibilities to support the disadvantaged. At the same time, that separation of religion and state serves a vital role in preserving American democracy and also creating broad space for spirituality and all of its polymorphous beauty to flourish. Keeping religion out of state affairs and government control out of religion, all of that fosters the vitality of religious life. So I think the controversy is about how we enshrine and embody and talk about religious values in our collective public life. And this is where I think people who don't have power in the congregations and religious organizations can still contribute to the self-critical project. And even if they're identifying as secular, because ultimately in advocating a conversation model of public discourse, I believe that conversation, that religious ideas need to be critically engaged. And that has at least two directions: the self-critical reflection that I spoke about earlier, but also being willing to have civil debate about other people's religious ideas, because religious ideas matter too much to give them a pass. Kathleen Kavani wrote a whole book, but the premise of it is she's trying to tease out the distinction between condemning something that we really think is terrible and saying so, but without contempt. The strategy I advocate really grows out of a teaching from Robert Audi, who talks about, and here he's got a scholarly name for it, a theoethical equilibrium. He says that where religious considerations appropriately bear on matters of public morality or political choice, religious people have a prima facie obligation to seek an equilibrium, a balance between those considerations and relevant secular standards of ethics and political responsibility. So this is not a matter of translation a la Rawls. It requires balancing what their religion teaches with a plural understanding of the broader public good. So people have to stand inside and outside their life stance to examine its impact. And it requires self-critical faith. It requires reclaiming the complexities of our traditions that we talked about earlier. And it requires a commitment to the common good of a diverse society. And I think that balancing act can help defend against powerful voices legislating morality for everybody, and at the same time help to construct a common civic virtue, help to pursue that as our common goal.
Vocab word of the day: theoethical equilibrium. Everybody write it down. Tell your friends. It's the new term for everyone to use. We're going to strive for it. Thank you so much, Rachel Mikva, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you.
And thank you so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. Another hope we have is that you'll come and join us for the Geltraiser, our amazing 8-night Hanukkah extravaganza. It's going to be awesome. Geltraiser.com. It's $36 to participate, or a $3 monthly pledge recurring. It's going to be amazing. We've got great guests coming. We also just want to hang out with you, our listeners. It's a great way to build our Judaism Unbound community. So we hope to see you there. And on that front of building Judaism Unbound's community, we always like to end our episodes with the different ways that you can be in touch with us. And here they are. First, there's our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. There's also Twitter and Instagram, also Judaism Unbound. There's our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, there are our email addresses, Dan@JudaismUnbound.com and Lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We really appreciate you listening into this episode. And with that, This has been Judaism Unbound.